Hey guys, Greg Chaplin here, physical therapist and strength and conditioning specialist. And in this video, we're going to answer the question, is neutral spine a myth? So if you've been in fitness for a while or you follow fitness influencers, you've probably heard this term neutral spine. Now, for some people, you've heard it in the context of that you need to have a neutral spine every time that you're doing an exercise or you're trying to achieve this state of neutrality. Whereas in other cases, you've heard that neutral spine is actually a myth and it's not something you should be worrying about. So we're going to answer the question, what is neutral spine? We'll talk about the differences between these different thought processes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So first of all, what is neutral spine? And I think a lot of the problem with the conversation around neutral spine is that we don't really have a solid definition. So I'm going to give you a couple of different definitions and then illustrate how, depending on this definition, a neutral spine could be something that's useful or it could be something that you should just disregard and not worry too much about. Okay, so if we look at my buddy Mr. Phibbs here, we look at his spine having these alternating curves. So in the lumbar spine and the cervical spine, we see this inward curve, which is called lordosis. And here in the thoracic spine, as well as in the sacrum, we see this outward curve, which is known as kyphosis. Now these curves are normal. There's nothing wrong with lordosis or kyphosis. In fact, it's good that you have them because these alternating curves actually help to promote balance in between the different areas of the spine. So we have this lordosis here in the cervical and lumbar regions, which pushes weight forward in space. And then we have this kyphosis in the thoracic and sacral regions that actually shift our weight back in space. And so it's this balance between forward in space and back in space that actually allows us to be able to stand in an upright position with relative efficiency. So we don't have to use a ton of muscles to be here when the actual structures, the bony structures that is, actually promote this alternating distribution of our weight in space. So now if this is our definition of neutral spine, this alternating curvature between different segments of the spine, then it probably is worth worrying about if we don't have access to that. So if we don't have access to that, it's possible that we might have to produce more muscular activation just to hold position of the axial skeleton. And if we have to produce that muscle tension to habitually hold the axial skeleton, that might reduce mobility or just make it a little bit harder and less efficient to do movements in general. Now on the flip side here, where you're going to hear neutral spine talked about as being a myth is that what I'm really describing here is just a static standing position. But humans don't move in one static position. We actually move through distributed movement across all the segments of the body, including the axial skeleton. So let's say I was doing something like moving from this standing position to a seated position. What we would see in that case is that this whole thoracic lumbar region would actually shift back in space a little bit. It would come into a little bit less lordosis, and then we might even see some different sort of balancing happening by the rib cage coming a little bit further forward, the head coming a little bit further forward, and the curvature that we were talking about in standing is no longer going to be the same when we go into that seated position. So which one of those spinal positions is neutral? Well, in a sense, either of those positions could be neutral as long as the forces around the spine are relatively balanced. And I think that theoretically there might be a perfect balance where we have equal pressures and volumes on both sides of the joint or in an optimal configuration on either side of the joint. But we're going to have a hard time measuring that. So from the standpoint of neutral spine being a myth, it is really this theoretical definition of this neutrality or this one point where everything is balanced that would actually be pretty elusive. So being able to bear weight over one leg and the other completely symmetrically and then having volumes and pressures distributed in the body completely symmetrically, it's really going to be a very finite point in space. And so actually achieving that is actually relatively unlikely. More realistically, this centered point where everything's balanced in all directions is actually more likely a point that we pass through. And while we do want to have access to be able to pass through those points, the actual time spent at that point or in those points is going to be relatively minimal. So with all this being said, I think that one of the more useful times to actually look at neutrality or neutral spine position is when we have some limited access to one of these normal curves. And one of the ones that I see very frequently is when people tend to bias themselves towards a little bit more flexion in the lumbar spine. So that normal lordotic curve is a little bit reduced. We actually have this flattening out of the lumbar spine. And because this flattens out in this direction, then the rib cage has to push forward a little bit to balance those forces front to back. And so what we get is decreased curvature throughout the spine. And like we said before, sometimes this means that you're going to have to apply a little bit more muscular activation at rest just to hold position. And that can do things like reduce mobility or increase tension in the body. So what I find to be pretty useful in these cases is to be able to restore this alternating position in those different regions of the spine to get a normal amount of lordosis, normal amount of kyphosis. And the positions that I see this being particularly important for would be standing and other day-to-day positions like sitting as well. If you're finding value in this video so far, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and like this video. All these things help the algorithm to help me help more people. So now let's go through a simple standing position that you can use to get this feel of neutral spine. Okay, so to do this activity, we can go in both directions, and you're going to see how these are pretty much doing the same thing in the opposite way. But what we're going to do is we're either going to go all the way forward or all the way back. So let's go all the way back onto the heels so that the toes lift up. And what this is going to do is it's going to move the entire spine back in space. So we're going to get a little bit more of that kyphosis, but we're also going to get a little bit less lordosis. So now, while maintaining that same shifted back position in space through the rib cage, we're going to allow this area of the lumbar spine to come forward just a little bit. And so here we should have this shifted back position where we have a little bit of kyphosis, and then we're allowing the shifting forward position where we have a little bit of lordosis. If we want to go one step further, we can make sure that the front of the neck is open as we bring the head slightly back, but allow the neck to come forward. We could think about that tailbone just ever so slightly tucking under as that top half of the sacrum shifts back. And so we're going to have kyphosis here in the sacrum, lordosis here in the lumbar spine, kyphosis in the thoracic spine, and lordosis here in the cervical spine. In terms of our weight distribution, we should feel that mostly we're balanced on that middle part of the foot. We have good contact with the heel as well as the toe, but the center point is over the middle. Now, another way to do the same thing is to let everything come forward in space to the point where the heels come up. And then in this position, what you're going to sense is that you have more lordosis. You have that thoracic kyphosis actually lessening a little bit. And so what we're going to do here is just shift that rib cage back in space a little bit until we get that middle part of the foot to come back into contact with the ground. We can ever so slightly do that movement of the top of that sacrum back in space and the tailbone tucking under without reducing that natural arch in the low back. And then once again, head up so the head's coming back, open front of the neck to let that lordosis come into the neck. And this is another way to get into that same balanced front to back neutral spine position. Okay, so that does it for this video. After watching and getting these two perspectives, do you think neutral spine's a myth? Leave me the answer down below in the comments and we'll keep this conversation going. If you haven't already, like this video, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you'll know when I upload a new video. And until next time, peace.